Hey everyone, let's look at railroads in city skylines and how to design and build them using principles from the real world. This is obviously intended for those of you who want to make a bit more realistic looking railroads in your city, because the game allows you to build quite crazy roller coasters that would be pretty impossible for a real life train to drive on. I'm going to divide this in multiple videos. In this first one, I'm going to go over some basic theory and general building tips together with introducing the necessary mods that we'll need. Then in the second one, I'd like to do an example build. And in the third one, I'll show you an advanced building procedure that I was using on the live stream, and I wanted to do a video about it for a long time now. I'll talk about some more theory regarding trains' speed in curves, and maybe some more general tips if I think I forgot to mention some before. Or maybe you will bring up some suggestions. Maybe the third video is actually going to be split in two, I'm not sure yet. I'm obviously not going to explain absolutely everything about real-life railroad design, because it would make the video a few hours long, so a lot of simplifications will be made, so it suits the game. So let's start with some short theory. And here we have two main characteristics that we need to think of if we want to build a proper railroad in this game. First, the curve radii, and then the railroad's slope or grade. Now, in real life, railroads as well as road curves are a bit more complicated. They usually have a transition curve at the start and the end, which makes the vehicles go into the curve more smoothly. This is important on railroads for all kinds of reasons, for example, passenger comfort or even safety, as the trains could derail or break the rails if they suddenly change in curvature and the train goes really fast. The transition curve is usually a geometrical curve called the clothoid or sometimes the cubic parabola. They are quite complicated, need to calculate a lot of parameters of these curves, and it's close to impossible to build it in city skylines. So this is going to be a major simplification as we are not going to build it, and we will only do simple circular curves to connect two straight segments. To the naked eye, the curves won't differ that much with and without the transition curves. Now, the curve's radius. There are guidelines which differ between countries, but probably not so much. So, the Czech norm says that the minimum curve radius for a newly built railroad of national importance should be at least 500 meters, and 300 meters for less significant ones or refurbished tracks. We can go all the way down to 190 meters, which is the minimum, but for very low speeds and special cases only, like station tracks, and sometimes even 150 meters, but that radius is already impossible to cross for certain vehicles. Now, even the 500 meter radius is still quite low, so ideally you want to go much higher, as high as you can, basically to maintain some design speed all along the proposed railroad. I'm going to explain the speed limits of trains related to the curve's radius in some following video. So now let's go over the vertical characteristic of a real-life railroad, which is the grade. Trains usually, at least the ordinary trains, can't really climb even moderately steep slopes. This is due to various reasons, mostly because of not enough grip. Now again, the Czech norms state that the absolute maximum grade must not exceed 4%. This means that on a track with a length of 100 meters, well, more precisely the horizontal distance of 100 meters, we can only climb 4 meters max. But this absolute limit is already quite brutal for most of the ordinary trains and might only apply in some special cases. Usually, the recommended maximum grade over here is 1.25%, but especially for cargo trains, tends to be even below 1%. 2.5% is then considered the recommended maximum in places where you just can't achieve the 1.25%, and you should only do it on short segments. If you can't even do the 2.5 and need to go higher, then you are basically killing the tracks for certain types of vehicles, and you really need to have a very good reason for that particular design, and it should be the last resort, probably in some really difficult mountain terrain, only for special passenger trains maybe, and so on. Let's now go over some principles that should be used in the design process. And all of them are quite clear and basically mean that you should always design the railroad so that the time it takes the train to reach its destination is as low as possible. In some cases, the requirements are that trains consume the least amount of fuel or energy while traveling on the railroad you are designing. In practice, that means designing low grades and very high curve radii. Also, grades should be constant on long distances, and changes in grade should not be very big. For example, I can't design a sudden change in grade from climbing 1% to going down 1% without smoothing the railroad a bit in between. So all in all, this means that an ideal railroad should be just a straight segment between point A and point B, right? But this is obviously only possible on completely flat terrain, and sometimes not even there because of maybe building in urban areas, roads, or other obstacles. Also, the straight line approach in more bumpy terrain might result in super deep cuts into the terrain, unreasonably high embankments, unnecessarily long tunnels or bridges. And also sometimes a straight path results in a really high grade, so you need to twist the railroad a bit to gather the elevation on a longer path. Another important thing is obviously the building cost. Some small regional railroad just can't be all underground or on some long straight bridge. It would never pay for itself in its designed life. So the first thing in the design process should be determining what you actually need to build. Some small regional railroad, or like a cargo railroad for low speeds, or maybe a high-speed railroad for passengers. Also, in city skylines, you might want to build like a historical railroad, which would have been built back in the day for low speeds, probably with a lot of curves copying the terrain features. Alright, so some practical tips. First, the mods we'll absolutely need for doing this. Number one mod here is the Fine Road Tools mod because of its straight slope feature. If I build a railroad in vanilla game, trying to go up, it will make the railroad flat until the last segment where it actually climbs to the height I wanted. This is unacceptable for a realistic railroad. So I'll switch on the straight slope feature and build the exact same thing. This railroad is 300 meters long. If I wanted to follow, let's say, 2% grade, I would climb 6 meters. See? Smoothly going up from the starting point. Also, the ability to switch railroad types is very handy as well. Next, precision engineering allows you to display more precise angles and distances, something we will need a lot. Extra landscaping tools, I'm going to use those because of the feature to display terrain height. If I just right-click with the level terrain tool, it shows me the precise height of the terrain right here. Toggle Topographic Lines mod, very handy, shows the topographic lines even when not doing terrain changes. And then Fine Road Anarchy and Move It, always useful to have with network construction. When doing the railroad curves, we will need to know two things about them: the radius and the length. From the information we have right here, the tangent line length and the angle between them, we can calculate the radius using this formula. Here we have a tangent of the angle divided by 2 multiplied by one of the tangent line's length. This of course applies to a circular curve, meaning the two tangent lines are the same. Next, the curve's length. Here we use this formula. It is 2 times pi times the previously calculated radius times 180 minus the angle over 360. The curve's radius is important to check if we are over the norms 300 or 500 meters, and later to calculate the train's speed for that curve, which again I'll show in the third video. The length of the curve is really important so that we know how much elevation we can do at the end of it based on the grade we chose. Now, these calculations are simple, although obviously even I don't want to do them every time I build a simple railroad. So I prepared a little guide on how to quickly yet accurately estimate these. Here in this table, I'll calculate the coefficients you need to multiply the tangent's line length with. Obviously, the tangent line is right here. You can see it right away. So, for example, if I do a curve with the angle of 90 degrees, the radius is the same as the tangent line, and the length is approximately 1.5 times larger. If I have an angle of 160, then the radius is over 5 times larger and length is almost 2 times larger than the tangent line. 180 is obviously not a curve anymore, so the radius is infinity and length equals 2 tangent lines length. I only included the 80 degree as the only example of below 90 degree curve, because you should not build below 80-degree curves anyway, as it's not a circular curve anymore in this game and doesn't look good at all. Check out my previous tips and tricks where I explain this. It's a guide for roads, but obviously useful for railroads as well. Anyway, back to the table. I included it in the video description. You might write it down and use it as a reference for your building, but you don't even need to do that. That's why I included these two angles here, the 127 and 143. If you remember these two numbers, then you are already able to do a basic estimate. For the 127 degrees, the radius is exactly twice the tangent's line length, and for 143, it's 3 times. So if you build a curve which has, for example, 130 degrees, let's say, then without looking anywhere, you immediately know it's at least twice as long as the tangent line, the radius, obviously. So for my example right here, I immediately know that I am above those 500 meters required by the norm. Also, when we look at the coefficient for the curve lengths, it only goes from around 1.5 to 2. So if you always use, for example, 1.5 for estimating the curve length, or like 1.8 for really big angles, then no matter the actual angle, you won't be that far off. And for reasons I'll explain in the third video, estimating the length lower is actually better for you because lower estimate will give you lower grade, which is what we want in curves. Alright, so I think that is enough of the basics. We will need all this to do an example build I'm going to do in the second part of this guide. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching. If you're new here, feel free to subscribe to the channel and I'll see you next time.